Okay, so the next video in the series is looking at how we can graphically represent externalities and their consequences for the market. Remember, we have said all year long that markets are really a perfect way for individuals to express their tastes and preferences regarding how resources should be allocated. When we get to market equilibrium, we're at allocative efficiency, meaning that consumers are completely satisfied and producers are completely satisfied. And this is all true so long as we don't have any external costs and benefits to the actions of the market. In other words, sometimes we'll have a market where the product in question will create benefits or costs to people who aren't part of the market, whether it is the consumption of that product or the production of that product that does it. There's a consequence for people who aren't in the market and therefore had no ability to express their point of view or their preferences in the market. And we call those costs and benefits externalities. Now, looking at a specific example, let's take cigarettes. And the reason economists will often take cigarettes is because as an example, is because there's very clear externalities to the consumption of cigarettes. And we probably all have had some experience with the negative externalities of cigarettes because we've probably all been around a smoker at some point in our lives. So if I have a cigarette right now, I do so because I wanted to. My tastes and preferences were such that I was willing to spend a certain amount of just money for the cigarettes. I'm taking into account the other costs associated with the cigarettes, for example, the health consequences, the fact that I'll smell bad, whatever. Social stigma is powerful, but I can still, as a rational actor, decide that I'd like to have a cigarette because the benefits of that cigarette are greater than the cost of having that cigarette. Now, you might say, I would never make that decision myself, but it's quite logical that some people would want to continue to have cigarettes as a rational actor. So we look at the demand and supply curve for cigarettes. I'm the consumer, I'm the one smoking the cigarettes. The suppliers are the tobacco companies. And market dynamics brings us to an equilibrium. I'm going to label that QEQ. I think you can see it at the bottom. And PEQ. This is the equilibrium outcome. Okay, I'll label this point. I'm just going to call it point 1. The equilibrium point in the free market creating an optimal output quantity and an optimal price. There's no way that we can make people better off, make suppliers or consumers better off without hurting the other, right? This is allocative efficiency. But if we're really honest about it, there's a lot more going on here than just my desire to have a cigarette or a tobacco company's desire to sell cigarettes. If I have a cigarette and I do so in, say, a crowded room, a restaurant or something like that, everybody around me has to deal with the secondhand cigarette smoke. And so that is a cost to society or a cost to people around me that is a result of my decision to have the cigarette, though those people had no choice in the matter. In other words, they're dealing with the negative consequences of the cigarette, but their preferences are not expressed in the demand curve. Only my preferences are. They're not part of the decision. Therefore, the consequences to them are external to the decision or external to the market. The market doesn't have a way for them to express their tastes and preferences. They'd rather not suck in a lot of secondhand cigarette smoke. So how do we use our understanding of market dynamics to see what's going on? Well, let's revisit the idea of the demand curve for a second. And if we look at demand, we could also call demand the marginal benefit curve. In other words, the demand curve is shaped the way it is because it reflects diminishing marginal benefit and increasing levels of consumption. The demand curve is, in a sense, an expression of how much smokers appreciate cigarettes or how much they value cigarettes or the benefit that they get from cigarettes, marginal benefit. Let's take it one step further, though, and now instead of saying marginal benefit, let's say marginal private benefit. In other words, the benefit that accrues privately to the smoker themselves, not to society as a whole, but to the smokers themselves. And that makes good sense, right? I mean, if you smoke, you do so, but you have good reasons to do so, and you feel that the benefits of doing so are worth the cost to you. That's what rational actors do. At the same time, let's look at the supply curve. Instead of just calling it a supply curve, let's go ahead and call it a marginal cost curve. And we've talked about this in previous screencasts. The reason we can do that is because the supply curve slopes up to the right because the increasing marginal cost of every unit of production, right? If I'm a cigarette company, I make another pack of cigarettes, there's a little bit of cost doing that. It might not be very big, but there is marginal cost. The increasing marginal cost of doing so means that a cigarette company will only accept, at minimum, a higher price to cover those marginal costs. Whether or not they get it depends upon the market dynamic. But remember, their supply curve will slope up because, hey, if I'm going to sell another pack of cigarettes, I better get a higher price for it because of the increasing marginal costs. Similar to the marginal benefit being called marginal private benefit, we're going to call marginal cost marginal private costs. In other words, these are the costs of the production of cigarettes that are borne by the producers themselves and only the producers. These are the benefits to smoking cigarettes that accrue to the smokers and only the smokers. So if we think, we haven't changed anything really in terms of what the curves are. It's still a demand and a supply curve. We just decided to look at it a little differently with a little bit of a different label. The demand curve is essentially a marginal private benefit curve, and the supply curve is a marginal private cost curve. And here's where we can start to think a little differently. Here's where this different thinking allows us to capture the effects of an externality. So think about the last time you were in a room where somebody was smoking and you had to deal with secondhand cigarette smoke. And that was you might think that you might be able to think of that as a cost to you, or at the very least a negative benefit. So if we want to think about the effects of the smoking, my smoking, for example, on everyone around me, the total benefit of my decision to have a cigarette is going to be something less than my own individual benefit. I have the cigarette, I enjoy it a certain amount, but because you have to deal with my secondhand cigarette smoke, in total, we enjoyed something less than my own sense of private benefit. In other words, the social benefit of me smoking is less than the private benefit of me smoking, right? Because you don't want that secondhand cigarette smoke. If we add that up over all smokers in society as a whole, we can see that my decision to have a cigarette actually creates a marginal social benefit that is something less than the marginal private benefit. MSB in this case, marginal social benefit, to indicate the marginal benefit to society as a whole. I enjoy the cigarette, and that's reflected in my demand curve. You don't enjoy the cigarette, that's not reflected in the demand curve. This is where the market is failing to capture the full effects, the full consequences of the cigarette. We can capture the full consequences of the cigarette if we consider something called the marginal social benefit of that cigarette consumption, right? If we consider the marginal social benefit of the cigarette consumption, and we have, and we will, and we did, we see that we actually are looking at a socially optimal quantity of cigarettes as QEQ1. So this is what the market determines, QEQ. But if we consider the consequences of secondhand cigarette smoke and the effects for the social welfare of everybody, we really should be consuming QEQ1. In other words, we're over-allocating resources to cigarette consumption. I'm going to just label this point 2. The market has decided we want this equilibrium of cigarettes, price and quantity, that quantity. But when we consider the consequences of the secondhand cigarette smoke, we really should be at this point, QEQ1. Is the market producing an allocatively efficient outcome? It is not. The market has failed. This is an example of what we call a market failure. That's a market failure. The market's not producing the right amount, right? Market's not producing the right amount. So what do we do about this? Well, what kinds of things do we do in society? We have designated smoking places. So for example, if I'm in a restaurant and I want to have a cigarette, I got to go out on the sidewalk. That way you don't have to deal with my secondhand cigarette smoke. We also tax, right? We tax cigarettes, and as we remember from our previous unit on taxes, if we were to tax cigarettes, the supply curve would shift like this. We would end up at an equilibrium somewhere in this area and reduce the quantity. In other words, there are a lot of things we could do to correct for the externality. It's called, economists will call it internalize the externality. In other words, make the market deal with the consequences of the negative externality. Is it possible to have positive externalities? Certainly. Things like a vaccine, for example. If you are vaccinated against disease, that's obviously good for you. There's private benefit to that. There's marginal private benefit for people who are getting vaccines. But everybody's better off when you're vaccinated because just of the way that diseases work. We're all healthier if we're all vaccinated. It's sort of an exponential effect. So we could look at marginal social benefit actually being positive, right? There can be positive externalities of consumption as well. We'll look at those certainly all through our videos and through class. But so let's recap here before we wrap up this video. What's going on? Well, there are certain products that when consumed or produced, we happen to be looking at a consumption example here, create what we call spillover effects or costs or benefits that affect people who were not part of the market in the first place. If you're not a smoker, you're not part of the market for cigarettes, but you still deal with secondhand cigarette smoke. And because of that, the marginal social benefit of my decision to have a cigarette is something less than the marginal private benefit of my decision to have a cigarette. The market has failed to provide an optimal output, right? Because by smoking this many cigarettes, we're actually making some people worse off, right? Some people worse off. If we do capture or internalize the externality, or we see that we have a marginal social benefit curve that shows benefits something less than the private benefit, and we end up at 0.2, which is socially optimal. This is the amount of cigarettes that we should have in society in order to capture all the tastes and preferences of everybody who is affected by the cigarettes, including people who are not buying cigarettes at all. They just happen to be around a smoker. So there's a number of things that we can do to get ourselves to 0.2. We regulate cigarette smoking, we have taxes, all that kind of stuff. Why don't we just get rid of cigarette smoking altogether, you might be saying, right? I mean, there's negative costs all over the place for cigarette smoke, including maybe even especially the negative externalities of secondhand smoke and things like that. Well, I think the answer to that is it's a free country, right? And if I'd like to have a cigarette because the benefit to me is greater than the costs, I still should be able to do that. At least that's the view that we have. So we don't necessarily regulate cigarettes out of existence, but we do try to do things to deal with the externalities. We try to control for negative externalities. If there's positive externalities, we try to actually promote consumption of that product. Like, so when we looked at subsidies earlier, subsidies are a way to promote the consumption of a product because of the high positive externalities of that. So again, this is the market failure, the inability to capture the external effects. This is how we can understand the significance of the negative negative consumption externality. We would correct this by maybe a tax or regulation or something. There's a lot of things the government can do to get us back to the appropriate socially optimal output of cigarettes. And so this is how we understand externalities. Now, what if the externality was a positive externality? Well, then the marginal social benefit would be on this side. What if it were a production externality? Well, then we'd just be looking at the supply curve. Negative production externalities would shift the supply curve this way. Positive production externalities would shift the supply curve this way. And we'll look at some of these examples in class and also with some videos. But this is sort of the basic understanding of what does how do we understand negative externalities, and how can we capture, or at least how can we view this in graphical analysis.